Have you ever wanted to play chess against a legend of the game? Well, I got that opportunity, and here's how it went. I was fortunate enough to be paired against extremely strong Ukrainian Grandmaster Vasyl Ivanchuk, who was former world number 2 on 3 separate occasions and beat every world champion after Bobby Fischer. This happened in the European Blitz Chess Championship of last year, and let's see how the game went. I started the opening with my usual Jobava London system, which starts after the moves d4 and knight c3 with the idea of bishop f4. So after a few moves, we reach my main opening. Now, what I really like about this game is that I didn't change anything. Even though I played a super elite player, it's very important that you don't change your entire openings, don't change your approach at all. Try to play your best game and see what you learn. Already, there's a bunch of ways for black to continue. There's e6, which is considered the main line. There's c5, there's g6, a lot of decent moves. Bishop f5 is a move, and my opponent chose e6. And here, the theory goes knight b5, which doesn't feature the idea of just wanting to capture here immediately. It's more about forcing the opponent's knight to the edge of the board. Knight a6 is the move played, and I just continue e3. And after my opponent kicks my knight away with c6, I just go back. But the point of this knight b5 and then retreating is to force your opponent to play these sort of strange moves that they otherwise wouldn't. They otherwise wouldn't put a knight on a6, and they would not play c6, they would like to play c5 instead. So it's more of a psychological hit as well as just generally being a good move. Game continues, knight to c7, just trying to get the knight back in the game, and later on there's a nice maneuver. This knight comes through e8 into d6, where it will cover some very nice squares. So after bishop d3, just normal logical development, my opponent continues bishop d6. And here, I can either allow the capture, at which point I recapture with the pawn and get a nice grip on the e5 square, or I can just simply retreat. Now, in the Jobava London, normally you want to leave this guy here. In the normal London system, when the pawn is on c3 instead, we just go bishop g3. But in this particular opening, it's better to just go knight f3, develop all your pieces, and if they extend, just recapture, as happened in the game. And the upside for white is that we have monstrous control of the e5 square. But the downside, of course, is that our pawns are doubled, which is a little bit harder to play with, and also we have less control over our d4 square. So let's see how the game continued. b6, logical development, trying to get the bishop out, and knight e2. This is a bit of a strange looking move, but here's the idea. I wanted to just normally castle, but if I do, then there are some problems with the move c5. And c5 I don't have a good way to deal with, because if I capture, they would recapture, and this is a very strong central control for black. And I would love to meet c5 with c3, but I can't. My knight is here. And I would also like to play knight e2 now. But what's the problem? The problem is that after c4, my bishop is trapped. So once we realize this, it's a little bit easier to understand why I prematurely play knight e2. I play knight e2 to be able to meet c5 with c3. I'm in no rush to castle, as the center is quite closed, so there is no real danger to my king. So this is just a move order trick to make my strategic position, my strategic ideas work a lot better. So that's why I played knight e2 over here. My opponent continued c5, and I continued c3. So looking pretty standard now. This is everything I would play even against a lower rated player. So it's, again, very important. Don't get scared just because it's a higher rated player. Try to play your best game, try to focus, don't get too caught up in numbers or rating or anything, and you should see yourself playing much better. So in this position, Ivanchuk continued with castling, and I also castled. And here, I got hit with bishop a6, which aims to trade off the bad bishop of black for my good bishop over here. Why is this the bad bishop? Because it's being blocked by its own pawns. Even if it comes to b7 or something like this, it's still very much blocked by its pawns. We don't want our pieces to be blocked, so that's why this is a very good strategic trade for black. And after bishop a6, I didn't care too much about this trade, simply because my whole idea of the opening, the whole idea of the Jobava London system, is to cover the dark's central squares. And I already had that under control. And I didn't really like playing the move bishop c2 or bishop e1, avoiding the trade. I thought it wasn't as important. So I decided to take, just to put the knight at the edge of the board again. So whenever you decide to trade, you have to think about how do you trade. So I didn't want them to take me, because after I recaptured, that's a good position, but I would prefer to have their knight on a6, because that's further away from their initial maneuver, which is, again, knight e8 and knight d6, and then the knight swings into these nice light squares. So I wanted to make that a bit slower, so I played takes, takes, and knight e5. It's the middle game, we want to improve our pieces, so I was thinking either rook e1, knight e5. I thought about queen a4, queen d3 to hit the knight, but that tempo isn't really so important, so I just continued knight e5. Also having ideas of knight c6, so they have to be a little bit careful. Rook e1, knight b d7, and just knight g3. I'm basically saying I don't mind the capture because that would fix my pawns. So if he captures into me, I recapture, also hitting the knight, and this would just be a better position for white on the count of the extra space with my pawns, and just the simply my pawn is the attacking pawn, meaning I can much more easily launch a kingside attack now because of the space given by the extra pawn here, and also this pawn is killing some nice defensive squares for black. So if I have this pawn on e5, they cannot have a knight on f6, which means that h7 is potentially a little bit weaker. So these are some ideas that I thought about in the game, so I was not scared of this capture. If he captures here, I just recapture with the queen, probably centralizing the queen pretty nicely. Let's see that quickly. So after this and this, the queen is very powerful in the center, unless it can get kicked away easily. So because they don't have any knight c6 options, my queen is doing very well here and controlling some nice squares. So none of the captures were a problem, and my opponent just continued g6. And after g6, a lot of players would just say, oh, okay, let's get my worst piece in the game, so I'm going to play rook a d1, and let's get the queen up or something like this. But I really wanted to play my standard chess. Before this game, I sat down to myself and thought to myself, basically, if there's one thing I want to achieve in the game against Ivanchuk, I know I'm very likely not winning, or not even drawing, but I want to play my absolute best, and I don't want him to change my playstyle just because of his rating. So usually I'm a very aggressive attacking player, or I try to be, because that suits my playstyle the most. So I saw the opportunity for h4, h5. And as I was thinking in the game, I probably thought that's what I would do against a low-rated player, like 2000, 1900, and against a player my level, 2200. So let's do it now. h4. And he immediately stops me with h5, but that's fine. So I'm thinking, what do I do next? Well, my worst piece at the moment isn't actually my rook on a1, it's my knight on g3. Because it doesn't have any prospects, any future prospects, that can't really move anywhere, so I have to reposition the knight. The question is where? And I thought that f3 is quite a good square, so I went on to play knight f1, knight h2, knight f3. Pretty straightforward plan, rerouting my worst piece to a better square. Knight h2, c takes d4, queen takes, as discussed before, knight takes e5, and now I have a choice. Do I take with a pawn or do I take with a queen? And initially, my reaction was pawn takes from earlier. I want to undouble my pawns and have this nice attacking pawn, but the more I looked at it, the more I didn't like it. Why? Because after f takes e, knight d7, there's a problem of rook c4, which also hits the weak pawn on h4. This pawn is being hit, so my pawns feel more like targets than space-grabbing and strong pawns. And I didn't want to allow this. Also, knight c5 could be an idea. This is a nice square to hop into e4, possibly. So I didn't like the idea of f takes e4, and I chose queen takes. Why? Simply because now, when they go rook c4, that doesn't hit my queen, so I have time to play the move g3 as well. And against knight d7, I can easily go queen d6. So that's what happened in the game, knight d7, queen d6. Why? Because, first of all, if I retreat, I lose my pawn. So I have to move my queen and defend my pawn at the same time. So I didn't want to play queen g5 or something like this. I preferred to go aggressive. Because my queen looks like it's attacking the king, but a lone queen really can't do much. So I chose queen d6. And now they can't take my pawn on the count of the knight hanging. So knight c5, and I was happy to trade off into an endgame. Rook takes here, and g3. Just connecting my pawns a little bit better. Even though my pawns aren't attacked at the moment, there are still various threats further down the line. So, for example, already knight d3 is going to fork a lot of stuff, one of those being this pawn. But even if it weren't for the concrete knight d3, which I could stop with, let's say, rook 81, even if it weren't for this move, I still like to keep everything connected. It's just a great habit in chess, especially if you're playing at lower levels, to keep everything defended at all times. Because you never know when something might be attacked and you don't notice it. So G3, B5. The point of B5 is to start launching a minority attack. A minority attack is when you attack more pawns using less pawns. The point is to try and create an isolated pawn among these. So if we trade, let's say 2 for 2, like this, the C3 pawn, the remaining pawn, will be isolated. Isolated from any other pawns, meaning it's going to be weak, and weak pawns just tend to get picked off. So if we imagine that situation, if I only have the C3 pawn, they could already start piling up with knight e4, and the knight and the rook would be attacking my pawn, and sooner or later it would fall. So this is the idea of a minority attack, to attack more pawns using less pawns. Knight f3, I just get all my pieces back in the game, or try to. A3, I'm trying to prevent the pawn trades as much as possible, but Ivanchuk finds that immediately he could go for this. Anyway, why? Because he's a very good player, obviously. Because after A takes B, A takes, C takes, if I just take everything, the point is that after knight d3, he's winning at least one of these guys back, and the remaining pawn, whichever he doesn't take, is going to be isolated and therefore a weakness. So objectively, material will be equal. Let's just see, rook d1, knight b4. Material is equal, but black is the one pushing for the win. How do I know that? Well, this is a weak pawn, as we just discussed, and these are double pawns. And double pawns are not always very weak, but it just means when pawns are double, they can't defend each other, which means it's really harder to push through. So here, g4 is really hard to make work, f5 is almost impossible to make work, so these are just basically staying here forever. While his pawn on the d file is a passed pawn, so at any point it could just start running. Not right now, of course, because it's attacked, but at any point, when the king comes in, when he has enough pieces, f6, e5, d4, these are just going to go through. So black is the one with a small strategic advantage, which allows them to push for the win, and white is the one trying to hold to a draw. So after rook ab1, I'm trying to push my pass pawn as well. I have hopes of unblocking, and then trying to use my pass pawn. Rook c7, king f1. When we're approaching the endgame, we want to get the king in the party, because we can't really get checkmated by so few pieces. Knight d4, always make sure to centralize your pieces. The center is very important. King f8, the king comes in, king e2. And at this point in the game, I saw that if I don't do anything, my opponent will just play king d6, f6, e5, takes, let's say, chase my knight away, and these will just start rolling until I'm out of moves. And they will go rook c2 to infiltrate, so I need to make something work. Which is why I tried f3, trying to go g4, trying to trade as many pawns, try to create pass pawns over here, something. Rook c4, and we can see how I'm basically almost out of moves. So it's like I played a decent game, a very decent middle game, I stuck to my principles, I played all the right sort of moves, and somehow I'm barely holding on to a draw. Simply, this is just a new class of player. I can't explain it any better. I thought I did everything right, but he is just so much stronger than me that he just recognizes the big picture, which is the fact that I'm the one barely saving a draw. I'm sure he recognized that from a mile away, even after we just got into the end game, he recognized this immediately. So if we come back to the game, I tried to make something happen on the king side, but it's just a lot of hope and nothing more. And the only mistake I made in the game, 92, it was a little bit too passive. Now, granted, we're both at 12 seconds here, so I'm panicking a little bit, but still, 92 is a bit too passive, and in an endgame, the last thing you want to do is be passive. So the way to continue trying to draw this actively would be to go rook a1 and maybe try to make something happen this way on the open file, put some pressure, stay active with the knight somehow, but just don't go into so-called turtle mode. It's never going to work against high-rated players. So 92, the only mistake of the game, and that's enough for Ivanchuk to take over completely. e5, takes, trying to minimize the amount of pass pawns I have to deal with. f4, trying to make this trade because then his pawn would be passed but also isolated, same like mine. so it could potentially become weak. But of course, Ivanchuk finds in seconds a way to completely break through my entire position. So after d4 check, I can't go king e4 because of the discovered attack. So after d3, I'm just losing a piece, which is why I went to f2. Now you may be thinking, why not f3? That stays a little bit further active, but again, it's going to be the same tactic. e4 check, and if I take d3, and I'm losing a knight. So that's why I noticed this with my 4 remaining seconds. So I played king f2 just quickly, just to stay in the game, even a little bit. Rook c2, he just makes further progress. So at this point, every move is played within 2 seconds at most. So just pinning my knight, and again, threatening d3. Whenever you're pinned, get out of there as soon as possible. King f1, d3 anyway, great move. And after knight c3, takes, my pawns are a little bit too weak. My king is cut off, my rook is barely holding onto my pawn. This rook is trying to keep the knight busy, but doesn't really do too much. And black recognizes that the weakness of these 2 pawns is enough to win. So rook c4, and I already have no way to defend this. So this pawn is falling, after that this pawn is falling, and it's just game over. With so many extra pawns, the monstrous activity is just too much for white to handle. So I tried to fight on for a little bit here with the last chance, but unfortunately, soon after, this pawn promoted. So let's see how it happened. Knight d3. So king f2 was my final sort of, I wouldn't say mistake because it's already losing, but the final misstep, simply because of knight d3 check. And I tried to play it off by playing king e3. I tried to play it off as what? Like I planned that. However, after the capture and the capture, the knight comes here with check, allowing promotion. And in this position, I resigned as Ivanchuk is getting a queen. Later, when I went to analyze the game through chess.com, I saw that these were the accuracies. So, first of all, 98.2 is mind-boggling for a 50-move blitz game. So, extremely well played from Ivanchuk. It was a privilege to watch that over the board and to just sit across from the legend and play him. But I'm also happy with mine, 90%, of course. And it's just a memory that I'll cherish for the rest of my life. I'm getting goosebumps right now. So hopefully this was cool to watch. The most instructive moment, the takeaway for today, is not to change your playstyle just because it's a high-rated opponent. If you want to beat high-rated opponents, this is how you do it. Don't change anything, play your best, and see if they make a mistake. And even if you're playing for a draw, if you are terrified or you need a draw to win the World Championship, you don't get a draw by playing for a draw. You get a draw by playing for the win and then falling back on a draw once you're in a better position. If you enjoyed the video, like down below to let me know, comment with any questions you might have, subscribe on my channel to see more, and I'll talk to you very soon. Take it easy.